What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to my video tutorial on how to paint the Sentinel Mark IV from Marvel Crisis Protocol. This is a short excerpt edited down from the full-length video I have on my Patreon. So I think this video ends up being about 15 or 20 minutes. The actual Patreon video is a little over 2 hours. So if you want to check out that deep dive as well as more on the theory and application, you can go to my Patreon and check that video out as well. So in this tutorial, we'll be covering just how to paint the Sentinel. I'm not going to be talking about the bases. And as mentioned, this is a trimmed down version, so I'm just covering the recipes and the colors I used. So the colors for the Sentinel are up on the screen now. So if you want to give the video a pause, note down those colors, and then we can dive right on in. So I'm going to start with an airbrush base coat of AK's Dark Sea Blue, and I'm going to apply this over all of the Sentinel. This will form the base coat for painting the blue as well as the Fuschia Armor. So with some AK Black, we're going to go ahead and paint in all of the joinery. Anywhere that's going to be the black rubber components as well as the metallics will all receive this base coat. I'm going to use ash gray and rubber black to wet blend the base coat of the rubber components. Now, I didn't record this for the actual Sentinel itself, but it's the exact same technique on the tire, so that's what you're seeing on the screen. From there, I'm going to use AK Graphite, and I'm going to edge highlight all of the edges of the rubber. This is a bit of a tedious step, but I do find that the end result looks phenomenal, so I think it's definitely worth the effort. I'm going to base coat all of the silver elements with AK's Ash Gray. I'm being careful to be neat at this stage, not to overpaint into any of the rubber elements, and I'm going to attempt to leave as much of the black lining as possible between the pistons and the ribbing. From there, I'm going to use AK Graphite to paint my first highlight. Particularly on the more reflective elements like the pistons and the ribbing, I'm going to be a little bit more dramatic and intentional to get a more chrome-like reflective finish on the metal. So I'm not really focusing on smooth transitions, but getting those bands of sharp highlights beside mid-tones and dark shadow tones. The next highlight is with AK Pale Gray, and I'm going to continue highlighting those bands of highlights I previously laid down, focusing more on the center portion, I guess, of the largest band. You'll want to make sure that because we're painting in sub-assemblies that you are dry fitting and testing the position. Make sure that you're getting the placement of your lights and shadows correct. And I'll keep highlighting this metal with AK's Pale Sand. The yellow tone, sort of eggshell white ivory of this color will help to brighten up the metal a bit, add a bit of color, particularly in the areas where we're receiving our direct light source, because I imagine it's going to be a yellow sunlit environment. I want the metal to have that warmer touch in the brighter highlights. And then I'm going to finish up the highlighting with some AK Greenish White. For this, I'm going to be focusing on only areas that receive direct sunlight, so we're not looking at any reflected highlights, and I'm focusing on the brightest elements so as not to overpower any of our pale sand from the previous step. I'm going to take a mix of black and ash gray, dilute it into a glaze, and I'm going to use this to do some washes and glazes on the mid and shadow tones of any of the metallic areas. So the goal here is to create a bit more of a blend, deepen some of those shadows, and then knock back some of our stronger highlights. I'm also going to go in with some pure diluted black and black line some of the cabling that I overpainted in my highlighting step. From there, we're going to touch up our highlighting using our pale gray, pale sand, and greenish white. So any areas where the glazes may have knocked back some of the highlights, or especially on the tubing that runs along, I guess, the internal middle of the arm, depending on where it's positioned, I'm going to go in with my dark, mid, or super bright highlight and just touch up some of those edges, bring back some of that sharpness and that pop. For some final detailing, I'm going to go in with pure black, again diluted, and for some of the bigger cabling, I'm going to paint some lines to add a bit of texture basically to it instead of having just plain tubing or plain wiring. For the blue armor, I'm going to start with a highlight of light Prussian blue. And this is going to be focusing on a lot of the broader areas of the armor. I'm only keeping the dark sea blue for my deepest shadows. So realistically, this is a base tone / first highlight. The majority of the armor is going to be covered by this color, and only the deepest shadows and areas of seams or some of those inset holes or pockets will remain the dark sea blue. I'm also keeping my brush strokes short and in a crosshatch manner to get some of that texturing and that weathering effect happening. And then to highlight, I'm going to start mixing in progressive amounts of Ducat blue. You can see I'm not really too concerned about smoothing my transitions at this point. The goal here is to block in the placement of lights and shadows, get the texturing across with the brush strokes, and generally I'm just working in a sketch phase. What will end up happening is if I make a mistake, if I find that I need to bring back a shadow or push a highlight or make changes, by keeping it loose and sketchy at this phase, I'm less locked in. I'm more inclined to correct or fix or even repaint areas I've already done. If I spend too much time in this phase trying to get perfect blends or perfectly smooth transitions, but I find that my placement of lights and shadows are wrong, or I've made a mistake and I need to correct or I need to readjust something, it's much harder if I spent 5, 6, 7 hours blending a surface than if I just spent 5 or 10 minutes here doing a really quick sketch over the entire surface. You can see here that as highlighting up, because the shoulder plate is essentially a sphere or an orb, I'm pushing a lot of highlighting into that front portion where we're receiving direct light from our light source. And then I am picking out areas where there will be reflected light from adjacent armor panels and elements. From pure Ducat blue, I'm going to start mixing into pastel blue. And it's pretty much the same thing. I'm just refining my highlights, getting sharper and sharper. As I get closer to pure pastel blue, I'm focusing that mainly on that bright spot on the shoulder pad where I want the highest contrast and the brightest pop. And then here is just pure pastel blue. For this color, I've mainly focused it on the top part of the model. We're looking at shoulders and the top of the chest and parts of the hands. To base coat the fuchsia pink armor, I'm using Sunset Purple from scale 75. I'm going to leave a lot of that dark sea blue in the shadow tones, and it's only in the mid-tones where we're going to get more of that Sunset Purple. The next highlight color will be Scale Colors Fuchsia, and I'm using this straight out of the bottle. We're just going to do a bit of feathering and some glazing to pull the color out. And again, really only focusing on those mid to bright tones. I want to keep some of that purple and that dark sea blue showing in the shadow to really get that richness and that nuancing to the armor. And then for my final highlight, I'm going to do a 50-50 mix of fuchsia and pale yellow. And for this, I'm really only concentrating on the brightest elements and the sharpest edges. Just like when we're painting red armor, too much pale yellow pushes it into a pink, it desaturates your color, and you lose that richness of the armor. With the airbrush, I'm going to use some light Prussian blue, heavily diluted, I would say 5 parts water, 1 part paint, and I'm going to focus on smoothing out the midtones and the shadows of the blue armor. You can do this step by hand. I'm choosing to do this with the airbrush, and you can really see that each step is just incremental glazes. Individually, no one layer has a huge impact, but as you apply more and more and more, it brightens up the deeper shadows a little bit, knocks back some of the highlights, and then where you have those rougher transitions, it'll smooth it out from your dark to mid to your bright, so you get a nice smoother blend. And I'll do the same to the pink armor with the Bloodfest Crimson. Again, diluted 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part paint, focusing on the mid and shadow tones. I'm attempting to spray from the direction of the shadows so as not to overspray into the highlights. With my compressor, I have it set to about 10 or 15 psi, so it's very soft. And then what I'm doing is I'm applying a little bit of color with the airbrush and then using the airbrush just to spray air to air dry each layer before applying the next. Again, you can do this by hand. The overall end result is the same. It's just faster with the airbrush. And then finally, with pure pastel blue and pure pale yellow, I'm going to fine tune some of the brightest highlights on the blue and the pink armor. Realistically, I'm just focusing on areas where I want the brightest spots. I'll throw in some specular highlights, and then where the airbrush did overspray, I'll just correct and bring back those brightest areas. Particularly on the pink armor, I'm focusing on some of those edges, and then I'm also picking out some of the more prominent chips and scratches I've already got on the surface to add a little bit more pop, focusing mainly on the arms and the upper parts of the legs. Base coat the faceplate, I'm using AK Leather Brown, and we're just going to apply a nice even base coat over the entire plate, ignoring the separation of the armor plates. I'll go back in afterwards with some dark sea blue mixed with leather brown to blackline that after I've painted the highlighting. My next highlight is with AK Tan Earth. And apart from some of the deepest shadows on the side of the faceplate, the bottom of the jowls, and the side of the nose, I'm more or less going to apply a solid highlight or base coat over the faceplate. I'm going to continue highlighting with AK Light Earth. And much like with painting the blue and the pink armor, because I want a textural, sort of battle-worn, reflective, non-metal finish to the faceplate, I'm going to use that short cross-hatching technique with the brush to simulate wear and tear on the surface. I'll apply some highlighting to the edges, and then freehand some more prominent scratches, chips, and dings. And then I'll finish up with some pure pale sands for my highlighting. This will be the brightest highlight step, focusing mainly on the top of the nose, around the eye socket where I'm going to have some OSL glowing from the orange eyes, and then along the edges, particularly on the lip. The top of the mouth plate actually curves outwards, so you want to make sure that you have some highlighting there as well. And then finally, I'm going to go in with some thin glazes of Tan Earth, focusing on the jowls, the sides of the nose, and the side of the cheek. I'm going to use Amaranth Red to base coat all of the orange, yellow, glowing elements. So we're looking at the chest plate, the energy elements on the hands, as well as the eyes. I'm going to use Vallejo Orange Red and apply a glaze over all of the Amaranth Red elements. Orange Red doesn't base coat particularly well. It's a fairly thin, translucent paint, so I used Amaranth Red to give me a solid base coat, especially on the chest plate, and then I'll use Orange Red to apply the glaze to get the color tone I want. I'll also be glazing the edge of the chest plate, as well as the armor plating around the eye socket, to get a soft orange tint to simulate that object source lighting. And there, I'm going to highlight with AK's Volcanic Yellow. I'm going to highlight the chest plate or the chest orb in accordance with the highlighting on the chest plate. So you can see here that I've got the brightest part of the chest plate is the top left. That's also where I'll be concentrating the brightest highlights of the chest piece. I'll continue highlighting with AK Yellow, and you can see that I'm really starting to push the highlighting towards that top left. The yellows are also fairly thin and translucent out of the pot, so you don't really need to mix any colors. Just dilute them a little bit, and when they're thinned down, you can just build up your layers to get stronger and more intense coats of color. With pastel yellow, I'm going to start to add some brighter spot highlights, and you can see that I'm also adding some line highlights within the chest piece to simulate a sort of infinity mirror. Rather than have a solid flat energy glow, I wanted to give the chest piece some depth to it, and I thought the best way to do this was to get some extra line highlighting to simulate a mirror sort of effect happening. And then my final highlight will be with pure AK White, concentrating on the top left corner, along the edges, and I'm including some specular dot highlighting on the corners as well. And then my final nuancing on the entire piece is using Games Workshop's Juchi Violet. I'm using this straight in the airbrush, no dilution, but still with the compressor set to about 10 or 15 psi, spraying from the shadows. I'm going to target everything on the model, particularly the blue and the pink armor, but if I overspray into the silver or the black ribbing a little bit, not a big deal. I also want to make sure that I target the base, and the goal is to finalize some nuancing on the piece, smooth out some last minute blends, and then create a unifying color in the shadows of the entire piece to situate everything in the same environment. You can see here on the base, I'm targeting a lot of the rubble, making sure not to overspray too much. I don't want it to turn too purple, just very soft in the shadows. And then finally, I'm going to use some weathering powders. This is a 50-50 mix of dark yellow ochre and burnt umber from Vallejo. And we're just going to target the crevices and recesses of the base Anywhere where there's rubble or debris, I'll target the recesses there as well. And then I'll do a light dusting on the bottom of the feet, as well as some of the posters, just to give the entire environment a little bit more of a worn battlefield feel, rather than something that's too fresh and too clean. Try not to go too overboard. Build up your color in incremental steps. It's a lot easier to add more weathering powder than it is to try and remove it. And then once I'm done, I'll use some mineral spirits that I will saturate the base with, and this will act as a fixer to seal the pigments to the base. This mineral spirits will take about 45 minutes to an hour to fully evaporate, but once it does, it'll set the powders, and then you can go back in with a varnish of choice. So I prefer a matte varnish. I'm using one from Mr. Hobbies. It's their super clear line. And this will protect the model for gameplay because this is ultimately a gaming piece. And that about wraps up this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more awesome weekly content. Again, this is an excerpt from a full, over 2-hour long video on the painting techniques I have on my Patreon. So if you want to check that out, or you want to see my other social media platforms, I'll make sure to have links in the video description below. I will also have a companion video for this on my Patreon that does a deep dive into the theory of the light and shadow application and how we work through each and every component on this model, as well as the other Mark IV and the Prime, and help break down this complex model into smaller steps. So if you want to check that out, again, it'll be on my Patreon. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, happy hobbying.